All right, everyone, let's talk about some of the best rare support champions in Raid Shadow Legends, and there are some really good rare supports. I'm actually really surprised. I think the game does a pretty decent job of making sure that even if you don't have certain epic or legendary champions, you can find some rares that are going to end up filling those roles. So you'll be surprised to find out that some of these rare champions are actually going to be better than a lot of epics or even legendaries that there are in the game. That's how good some of these skills are going to be. Now, with that being said as well, there are a lot of really good ones, and I know there's going to be some that I miss out in this video. I originally had a list of around 14 to 15, but I'm probably going to just talk about 7 or 8 in the video today. So if you're thinking of somebody in specific and I don't mention it, I might get around to it in either a part 2 or talk about it eventually at some point. Now, with that being said, let's jump right to it, and let's talk about what is going to be known as one of the best rare champions in the game by far. Not even just a rare support specifically, but just one of the best rare champions in general. And that is going to be a champion in the High Elves category, none other than Apothecary. Now, Apothecary is absolutely phenomenal. Easily one of the best rare champions in the game, and definitely going to be a champion you're going to want to take to level 60, even if you are somebody who has moved past the beginning game and you're more an intermediate or advanced player, still going to be worth taking to level 60 because that is how good he is. So if we take a look at his auto attack, it's going to be attacks 3 times at random. Once again, you're always just looking for anything better than just attacks one time. Attacks one enemy 1 time, so 3 times is going to be really good for the Giant Slayer masteries. Very good, going to be useful in the clan boss. Definitely not a bad auto attack. Then you move on to his second skill, which is going to be heals a target ally by 35%. This heal can be critical, so it can actually heal quite a bit of HP, and you can lower it down to a 2-turn cooldown with duplicate champions or skill books as well. And finally, you have the absolute pinnacle and reason why Apothecary is such an unbelievable champion, and that's this phenomenal buff, which is Boon of Speed, places a 30% increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns, fills the turn meter of all allies by 15%. And yes, it says it has a 5-turn cooldown, but with duplicate champions or skill books, you can lower this down to a 3-turn cooldown. Absolutely insane buff. The combination of this buff, the heal, and having a decent auto attack all on a rare champion going to make him, once again, not only just one of the best rare supports in the game, but overall one of the best rare champions in the game. So Apothecary is definitely somebody you will not regret taking to level 60 at all. So that's going to be number 1 on the list. Now, number 2, we are going to move on from the High Elves to the Dark Elves and talk about another really good support. And something amazing about this support champion is she is actually a farmable unit, which means you can get her from the campaign. You don't have to rely on Ancient Shards or Insane Luck from Mystery Shards, and that is going to be Spirithost. Now, I briefly talked about Spirithost in one other video, but I have not really talked about her too much. She is an absolutely phenomenal support unit, especially considering she is a free champion. And by free, I mean you can farm her. So her first ability, her auto attack, not really that great, but Spirithost really isn't going to be about damage. So you don't really have to worry too much about this auto attack. Attacks one enemy, heals by 50% of the damage inflicted. Again, not the best. Sure, the extra heal is nice in certain situations, but you're not really going to be building Spirithost for damage. You're going to be building her to stay alive for her second and her third abilities. Now, her second ability is Strengthen, places a 50% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. This is the stronger version of increased attack, which is nice. The weaker version would be 25%. All allies for 2 turns. Says 4-turn cooldown, but again, with a duplicate champion or with a skill book, you can lower the cooldown down to 3 turns. And the fact that she's farmable means that you don't even have to use skill books if you don't want to. You can actually just farm multiple copies of her to max out her skills if that's the road that you want to go down. And her third skill removes all debuffs on all allies, places a block debuffs buff on all allies for 1 turn. So 6-turn cooldown, you can lower it down to a 5-turn cooldown. Really useful, definitely going to come in handy in certain situations. The combination of this third utility skill with this second support skill, and she also has an increase all allies speed in all battles by 10%, even though that's the weaker version. Still, speed is going to be one of the most powerful stats in the game. If you don't have a speed aura, at least that's something right there. And overall, for a farmable rare support, definitely going to be very, very strong. So that's going to be number 2, which is Spirithost. Now we're going to move on from the Dark Elves to Night Revenant. and we're going to talk about Theurgist. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it, by the way. I know pronunciations are not my strong point ever since the big Un incident, but we have Theurgist here. Now let's go through Theurgist skills. So if Ice Debris attacks one enemy, fills the turn meter for a random ally by 10%. Interesting, not the absolute best auto attack. It's going to be the basic, just attacks one enemy one time, but you also have this fills the turn meter of a random ally by 10%. Again, it's just a nice little bonus, probably not really going to be too big of a game changer, but might come in handy in certain situations. Then you have the second skill, Touch of Sealing, attacks one enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a block buff's debuff for one turn. That could come in really handy, especially considering how with duplicate champions or skill books, you can actually increase this up to a 100% chance, and you can lower the cooldown down from 4 turns to 3 turns. So that's definitely not a bad second skill at all. And the reason why I personally put Theurgist on the list is because of this third ability right here. Now, it might look familiar to a new epic champion that actually just came out, and that is because it's just going to be the weaker version of it. So Madame Cerise is a recent Void epic that came out, very strong because she has a skill very similar to this, except it's going to be the stronger version of the increased defense and increased attack. You have the weaker version of it on this champion, but of course Theurgist is just going to be a rare, also not a Void rare, so going to be a bit easier to get. Uplift places a 30% increased defense buff and a 25% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. 5-turn cooldown, but you can double book it or double duplicate champions to lower it down to a 3-turn cooldown. And once again, it's going to be the weaker version of that really powerful ability that Madame Cerise has. Unfortunately, it's not the strong version, 30% and only 25%, but it is still 2 buffs in 1 ability, which I always like because that means that if you are somebody who is a beginner or intermediate player, you can end up opening up maybe a slot on your team, or you can open up some positions to have other champions kind of fill other roles. You don't have to worry about having too many champions trying to fill all those different buffs and debuffs, and it's really nice, but again, because it's the weaker version of it, you're probably going to end up outgrowing this champion at some point before you get to the absolute endgame stages. But not a bad addition to have if you don't have any kind of increased defense or attack buff on your team at all. So that's going to be Theurgist. Now we move on to another champion that is also in the Knights Revenant category, and that is going to be Arcanist. Let's see, Arcanist's attack 1, his auto attack. Her auto attack. Attacks one enemy, has a 20% chance of placing a sleep debuff for 1 turn. Okay, not amazing. I guess the sleep debuff is a nice little addition to have, especially considering you can actually increase it a decent amount with skill books. But it's not until you move on to the second and third skill that makes Arcanist really, really good. Unnatural Recovery places a 15% continuous heal buff on all allies for 2 turns. You can lower this down to a 3-turn cooldown, and that is really nice to have. Continuous heal is a pretty strong buff, and having it on your entire team on a rare champion with a 3-turn cooldown, definitely not too bad. But you also have this third ability, which is going to be a nice double buff as well. Places a 25% increased attack buff and a 15% increased crit rate buff on all allies for 3 turns. You can lower this down to a 4-turn cooldown as well. Unfortunately, it is the weaker version of increased attack and increased crit. And I always like to say, when it comes to the buffs, increased crit is going to be lower on the totem pole in terms of effectiveness, because eventually you're going to end up getting your champions to the point where they're going to outgrow the increased crit rate buff, because they're probably going to have 100% crit rate on their gear anyway. But if you're somebody who is still in the beginning game, maybe mid game, and you don't have 100% crit rate on your champions, it's going to make it easier to end up gearing up and kind of getting to that goal. But you will end up eventually outgrowing a lot of the crit rate buffs. Still a nice 2-in-1 with the continuous heal and a decent auto attack. Definitely not a bad support rare at all. So that is going to be number 4, Arcanist. Now we move on to the Dwarves. We haven't been to the Dwarves category in a little while, and we're going to talk about Master Butcher, which is going to be this guy right here. I don't believe I've talked about him before. I could be wrong, but he is not going to be a bad support champion at all. A lot of the rare Dwarves are actually really good, surprisingly, and Master Butcher is going to be one of those. So we have his first skill right here. Attacks one enemy, has a 30% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn. His second ability, which is going to be one of the reasons that makes him a very strong support, is we have a 3-in-1 ability here. So it accomplishes 3 goals in 1 ability. Very, very good. Places a provoke debuff on the target enemy for 2 turns. Places a 15% increased crit rate buff on all allies for 2 turns. And places a 25% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. So that skill accomplishes a lot of things. You've got 3 things going on at once. 5-turn cooldown, which can be lowered to a 4-turn cooldown, and overall just a very, very strong skill. Now, Master Butcher only actually has these 2 active skills, as auto attack and this skill right here, but he has 2 separate passives, which are actually going to be pretty strong as well. Heat Exchange. When attacked, heals all allies equal to the amount of damage taken. So that is a very strong passive. It says 3 turns cooldown, but again, you can lower it down twice with either duplicate champions or skill books down to just a 1-turn cooldown. Doesn't work against bosses, or it might be a little bit too strong, but still a pretty strong passive nonetheless. And you also have his last passive, which is a 6-turn cooldown, could be lowered down to 5 turns. Revives a random ally with full HP when this champion is killed. So overall, for being one of the dwarves and a support champion, definitely not too bad, especially because of this second ability right here, which has 3 separate things in it at once. Now we are going to move on to the Undead Hordes, and there's actually going to be 2 interesting things, or a couple interesting things about these next 2 champions on the list. First of all, we are going to talk about this champion right here, Banshee. And Banshee is going to be one of the very few rares in the game that actually has an area of effect auto attack. Grave Chill attacks all enemies, has a 20% chance of placing a 30% decreased defense debuff for 1 turn. So you have a lot going on for this champion. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but first of all, you have an area of effect auto attack, which is very, very useful, especially on a rare champion. And you also have this decreased defense debuff on the auto attack, which you can actually boost a little bit with skill books. Then you have a second skill, also going to be an area of effect. 3-turn cooldown can be lowered down to a 2-turn cooldown. Attacks all enemies, has a 50% chance of removing 1 random buff from each target. This can be buffed as well with skill books up to a 65% chance. And this is a very strong, very underrated skill overall, especially consider you could lower it down to a 2-turn cooldown and increase the chance of actually removing the buffs by another 15%. So very strong skill. Then you have the third skill, Death Ray, attacks 2 times at random. Each attack has a 50% chance of placing a block cooldown skill debuff for 1 turn. So overall, I think Banshee is a pretty underrated rare. Not only is Banshee a good support rare, but because Banshee has an area of effect auto attack and also another strong area of effect skill, you can actually build Banshee to be a pretty decent campaign farmer and overall accomplish a lot of things, including filling a pretty good support role in your team. And finally, we are going to talk about another very surprising support unit. That's right, this is a support champion. A lot of people probably don't think of this champion as a support champion, but they are, and that is going to be in the Ogren tribes, and it's going to be none other than Bellower. That's right, Bellower is a support, for those of you guys that didn't know. So once again, just like Banshee, I wanted to include these 2 champions at the end because they both kind of shared this feature, which is they are area of effect farmers. They have an area of effect auto attack, and Bellower has all of his skills as AoEs, which is why he's considered, as of right now, the best campaign farmer in the game. With Nightmare campaign coming out, though, is this still going to hold true? That might be a little bit hard to say, but very strong champion for 2 goals. Not only is he going to be a good area of effect champion, but he also has a lot of support and utility attached to him as well. Attacks all enemies, has a 20% chance of placing a block cooldown skills debuff for 1 turn. That's going to be, again, area of effect. And it has some nice little utility which you can buff with skill books. Second ability, Mighty Bello attacks all enemies, has a 50% chance of placing a 15% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns. And as you can see, you can lower this down to a 3-turn cooldown and increase the debuff chance by 25% with duplicate champions or skill books. Probably going to be using skill books for Bello because he's a void. And those of you guys who've watched some of my other videos, you know that I've been playing since April and I still don't have a Bellower yet. He's one of the very few rare champions that for some reason I just can't end up getting him. I don't know why player refuses to let me pull him. And you have this skill right here. Attacks all enemies, has a 75% chance of placing a decreased attack debuff for 2 turns, has a 75% chance of placing a decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. It is going to be the weaker version. You can boost that 75% chance all the way up to 100% with the duplicate champions or skill books. You can lower it down to a 4-turn cooldown, and this ability overall is insane. Absolutely insane to have this on a rare champion. You have an AoE, which first of all is always going to be good. You have what you can end up getting to 100% chance of placing a decreased attack and a decreased defense debuff on all targets. Even though it's going to be the weaker version, you've got so much going on with this ability and so much going on with Bellower in general. It's pretty crazy that not only is he going to be just an area of effect farmer and all of his skills are AoEs, but he has an absolute insane amount of support and utility added to him as well. So very, very strong champion. And once again, I wanted to include Banshee and Bellower at the end of the list because they are really good supports in addition to the features that most people normally know them by, which is just going to be AoE farmers. So definitely don't neglect all the extra utility that they have added with their skills as well. So as you guys can see, there are plenty of other champions that I wanted to talk about in this video, but I'm going to leave it here for now. I might end up doing a part 2, or I might talk about some other rare supports in other videos in the future, but I don't want this video to end up being too long. So with that being said, thank you guys everyone for watching. I'm really hoping that you guys enjoyed this video and this list helped out. And if you guys did enjoy this video and you want more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel. Really do appreciate all the support, everyone. So thank you once again for over 21,000 subscribers. If you want to help and toss a quick like, only takes about a quarter of a second. It really does mean a bunch. So thank you to all of you guys who do that. And of course, if you're interested in more Raid Shadow Legends videos, guides, tutorials, and all that fun stuff, they should be popping up right about now. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great day. And this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.